Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The Night's Voice. I had been driving through the winding roads of North Carolina for hours, the night creeping in around me like a thick fog. It was the kind of darkness that feels heavier than just the absence of light, a silence that presses against your chest, making every breath a little harder to take. The headlights of my car sliced through the blackness ahead, illuminating the trees in quick, ghostly flashes. But something felt off tonight, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The road was lonely, no other cars, no signs of life. I had passed a few small towns earlier, each one seeming to fade into the next, a blur of fading lights and shadows. I hadn't planned on staying out this late, but when the GPS showed a detour, I thought I'd take the opportunity to explore a bit. I wasn't expecting the detour to lead me here, to this forest, this place where the road seemed to end and the trees closed in around me like a shroud. A low hum filled the air, the kind of noise that comes from something too quiet, something that shouldn't be there. I rolled down the window, hoping to shake the feeling that had settled in my stomach. The breeze that slipped inside the car was damp and cool, but there was an unsettling weight to it. And then, I heard it. A voice. It wasn't clear at first, just a whisper, faint and distant, like the wind itself had formed words. "Come closer." I froze, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and the voice had sounded almost inviting. But there was something unnatural about it, something that made my skin crawl. My first instinct was to ignore it, to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then the voice came again, clearer this time, like it was coming from just beyond the trees. "Don't leave." I swallowed hard, trying to calm the racing thoughts in my mind. It had to be an animal, some odd creature of the woods mimicking human sounds. My heart was pounding in my chest, my fingers tightening around the wheel as I tried to convince myself that it wasn't something else. But the voice was persistent. "Stay with us." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked around, trying to spot anything that could explain the strange sounds. The forest was dense, thick with shadows, the trees looming like dark giants in the distance. But there was nothing but the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. My pulse quickened. Something about it felt deliberate. It was too clear, too real. I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring to life as I tried to leave the voice behind. But no matter how fast I drove, the feeling of being watched, of being pulled deeper into the woods, wouldn't go away. The sound of the whispers faded but didn't disappear. They lingered in the air, like the rustling of leaves that was almost too subtle to hear. Was I losing my mind? Or was something out there, something waiting in the darkness? I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. The voice had begun to fade, but the unease hadn't left me. It felt like I was being hunted, even though I hadn't seen a single soul. As I turned another bend in the road, the trees seemed to grow even denser, their twisted shapes forming dark tunnels that swallowed the light. For the first time, I felt truly lost. That was when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. It wasn't clear at first. Just a shadow, like someone had stepped out from behind a tree. My breath caught in my throat. I braked hard, the car screeching as I came to a sudden stop. I stared at the figure, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my palms sweating against the wheel. The air around me grew colder. I tried to look away, to drive off, but my eyes wouldn't leave it. The figure stood completely still, like it was waiting for something. My mouth went dry. I didn't know whether to scream or drive away, but all I could do was watch. And then, as if it had read my mind, the figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. It was only then that I noticed the details, a pale face, gaunt and hollow, and eyes that seemed to glimmer in the dark, like they were made of glass. There was no sound, no rustling of leaves as it moved, just the feeling of being watched, of being drawn in. I wanted to drive away, but my hands were frozen to the wheel. My foot couldn't find the gas pedal. And then, without warning, the figure spoke. Its voice was the same one I had heard earlier, now sharp and clear, as though it had been waiting for me. "Come closer." The world around me seemed to stop. The only sound now was the relentless beat of my heart, louder than anything else. I didn't know what was happening, or what was real anymore. All I could think about was the voice that now felt as though it was in my head, pulling me closer, making me forget the fear, the danger, the need to escape. And then, as the figure took another step toward the car, I heard another voice, this time from inside the forest, deep and dark, like a growl. "Stay away." It was a warning I ignored. I don't know what compelled me to stay. I don't know why my body didn't move, why I didn't slam the car into reverse and race away into the unknown night. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way the voice had wrapped itself around my mind, drawing me into its grip like a puppet on a string. But something was different now. The air felt denser, heavier. The once quiet forest had come alive with sounds that weren't quite right, shifting shadows, unnatural rustling, and the sound of something moving in the trees. The figure was no longer standing at the edge of the trees. It had stepped forward, closer to the road, its pale, glassy eyes fixed on me, unwavering. Its features were more distinct now, sharp, like a skeleton barely covered in skin, with hollow cheeks and thin lips that barely moved when it spoke. "Come." The voice whispered again, louder this time, more insistent. "It's not far. You're almost here." I couldn't look away, even though every instinct in me screamed to flee. Something about its gaze paralyzed me. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but my voice was stuck, caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. I was too terrified to speak. The figure took another step toward me. The air turned colder, the temperature dropping suddenly as if the night had swallowed all warmth. And in the distance, through the trees, I could hear the faint sound of something moving. Not the soft rustling of leaves, but something heavier, closer. Something alive. My fingers were still gripped tightly to the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I kept telling myself I could just drive away, that I could escape whatever this was. But every time I tried to move, the fear sank deeper into my bones, heavier than any weight I had ever known. I couldn't leave. It was like the darkness had a hold on me, its grip tightening with each passing second. Then, just as I thought I might finally break free, the figure stopped, standing still again. A long, shuddering silence fell over the car, and for a moment, I thought, just for a moment, that I had imagined it all. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, the result of too many hours on the road, too much isolation. But then the voice came again, this time from behind me, from somewhere deep within the woods. "Stay, with US. It wasn't the same voice as before. It was older, more ragged, like it had been torn from the throat of something unnatural. It was deeper, more guttural, filled with malice. The voice wasn't just calling me, it was pulling at something deep within me, something primal, something I didn't understand. I spun in my seat, heart hammering in my chest. But there was nothing behind me. The woods were still and silent, only the shadows of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I could see nothing, hear nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat. But the voice was still there, echoing in my mind. Stay with us, forever. I looked back toward the figure, now standing directly in front of my car, its head tilted as if studying me. Its lips curled upward into a faint, twisted smile, but I could see the emptiness in its eyes. There was nothing human left in that face. Nothing alive. I wasn't sure if I could breathe. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. It was like the air around me had become thick with something poisonous, something I couldn't escape. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I didn't know how to make it stop. The car seemed to close in on me, the walls of it pressing in, trapping me in the middle of this twisted nightmare. And then, as if to mock my growing panic, the figure spoke again, its voice as calm as the night itself. You're already here. The words hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, their meaning crawling under my skin, settling into the pit of my stomach like a knot that wouldn't untangle. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away, but my body was frozen, stuck in place. Something was coming, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it, creeping closer. The trees around me seemed to shift, their branches twisting and stretching like fingers reaching for me, for the car, for everything. The whispers in the air were growing louder, more insistent, like 100 voices all calling at once, all pulling at me, urging me to stay, to follow. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The voice in my head was stronger now, louder, urging me forward, telling me that I was already part of it, that I had no choice but to listen. My mind raced, trying to reason with itself, trying to find a way out of this madness. But there was nothing. No explanation. No escape. Then, as if breaking some invisible barrier, the voice suddenly became clear, sharp, and terrifying. It wasn't calling me anymore. It was demanding. Get out. The words were not just spoken, they were felt. They thrummed through the air, vibrating in my bones, pulling me toward the figure, pulling me into the waiting darkness of the forest. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to move. But just as I started to reach for the door handle, a sound broke through the air, a sharp, crackling noise, like something heavy was moving just behind me. I turned to look, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, dark and massive, something that didn't belong, stepping out from between the trees. It was not human. Not anything close to human. It had no shape, no form, just a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to shift and grow with every passing second. And it was coming for me. I knew then that running was no longer an option. The moment I saw it, I understood. There was no escape. Not from this place. Not from whatever it was that had been luring me deeper into the forest. The shadow, a vast, dark mass of shifting shapes, was moving toward me, stretching across the road like it owned the very night itself. My hands shook violently, and for the first time, I felt completely and utterly helpless. I slammed the car into reverse, my heart pounding as the tires screeched against the gravel. The figure, the shadow, it was coming closer, its form growing more defined, as if it had been waiting for me. I could hear its movements now, the crackling of leaves under something heavy, the faint, sickening sound of breath that wasn't quite human. "Stay, with us." The voice echoed in my mind again, this time blending with the unnatural sound of the shadow moving. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a command, a force I couldn't ignore, pulling me toward it. The car jolted backward, but the trees around me seemed to close in, their branches stretching like fingers, blocking my way. I hit the brake, panic surging through me as I realized there was nowhere to go. No way to escape. The shadows, the voices, they were everywhere now, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. I glanced over my shoulder, searching for an opening, but all I could see were trees. No road. No way out. I was trapped. My mind raced, my chest heaving with shallow breaths. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't real, I told myself. It couldn't be. But then I heard it, an unmistakable sound, something that didn't belong. The faint sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps, coming closer, closer to the car. My breath caught in my throat. It was behind me. I turned back to the road, my heart skipping a beat as I saw it. The figure, the one that had first whispered to me, was standing in front of the car now, blocking my way. Its hollow eyes glimmered with something dark, something ancient. Its mouth curled into that twisted smile again, and the words it spoke were like venom in the air. "Tom." The air felt thick with dread, as if the very atmosphere around me had been poisoned. My hands were trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, but I didn't have a choice. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it take me. The only thing I could do was drive. With a burst of adrenaline, I slammed the car into drive and floored the gas pedal. The engine roared to life, and the car lurched forward, crashing through the underbrush, the wheels spinning wildly as I tried to escape. I could hear the sound of something following me, something large, something that moved with a speed that shouldn't be possible. It was gaining on me, every step closing the gap, until I felt it, the presence, as though something cold and malignant had wrapped itself around the car. I didn't dare look back. If I did, I feared I might never look away. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning, and with every corner I turned, I felt the shadows creeping closer. The trees bent over me, their limbs reaching like claws, and the whispers were louder now, sharper. There was no sound of wildlife, no night creatures or the usual rustle of leaves. The forest was silent except for the voices, voices that came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Stay, stay with us." I felt the weight of those words, pressing down on me like an invisible hand. The air grew heavier, colder, and the car seemed to slow, as if the road itself was pulling me back. My eyes were wide, fixed on the narrow path ahead, but all I could see were shadows dancing on the edges of my vision. I could feel it now. The pull. The inevitability. The road began to twist in on itself, the trees growing closer, until I was surrounded, enveloped in a tunnel of blackness. It was no longer a road. It was a trap. The tires squealed as I tried to navigate through the increasingly tight turns, but every direction I went led me deeper into the heart of the forest, further into the unknown. And then, just when I thought I might lose control, I saw it, a clearing ahead. The trees parted, and for the briefest moment, I thought I might be free. But as I sped toward the opening, my headlights caught something at the center of the clearing. A figure. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything human. It was standing there, motionless, but its presence filled the entire space, as though it were more than just a shape, it was the darkness itself. I could feel it in the air, suffocating and oppressive, pulling at my soul like a magnet. The car was skidding now, sliding on the wet ground as I tried to steer, but the wheels weren't responding. It was as though the clearing itself was alive, a trap that had already ensnared me. I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn. The figure in the clearing lifted its head, and for a moment I saw its face, pale, hollow, eyes dark and empty. "Come closer." The voice came again, this time so loud that it vibrated in my skull. The world seemed to tilt as the car crashed toward the figure, and for a brief moment I thought I might collide with it. But the instant before impact, the figure stepped aside, its hollow eyes never leaving mine. And I understood. There was no escape. The moment the car passed through the clearing, the road vanished. The trees closed in, the shadows enveloped me completely. I had driven into the heart of the forest, the very heart of whatever force had been calling me. And then I heard it, soft, slow, and inevitable. Footsteps. They were following me, always following me. The car was moving now, but I wasn't in control anymore. It was as if the forest had taken hold of the wheel, guiding me deeper into the dark. I could feel the tension in the air, the suffocating weight of the silence that had descended. The whispers had stopped. The voice that had beckoned me into the woods was gone, but its presence lingered, thick and oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the trees themselves were closing in, bending toward the car like they were alive, hungry for something. The headlights barely cut through the dark anymore. The road ahead was swallowed by the night, and I couldn't tell if I was even still on the path. It didn't matter. The forest had become my reality now. The trees blurred into one massive shadow, the only constant being the sound of my breathing and the beating of my heart in my chest. But then the footsteps started again. At first, it was faint, just a soft, irregular tapping. I dismissed it as the sound of branches brushing against the car, the wind playing tricks on my senses. But then it grew louder, closer. A slow, deliberate rhythm, like someone walking just behind me, their steps in time with mine. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest was still. The road behind me empty, nothing but darkness. Just my mind, I thought, just my imagination. But the footsteps persisted. They weren't in the forest. They were inside the car, circling me, coming closer with every passing second. I could hear them as though someone was standing right beside me, just out of sight, their breath cold on the back of my neck. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. I couldn't let the fear take over. I couldn't let it control me. But that's exactly what it was doing. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the car steady. The road twisted, a sharp bend that threw me off course. I swerved, my heart leaping into my throat as the tires screeched against the gravel. For a moment, I thought the car would roll, that I'd crash into the trees and be lost forever in this nightmare. But somehow, I managed to regain control, my foot pressing hard on the gas, pushing the car forward, away from the creeping dread. But as the car sped forward, the footsteps quickened. The rhythm was now a heavy, determined pace. Someone was following me, walking just out of view, taunting me, closing in. "Don't look," I told myself, my mind screaming at me not to turn my head, not to confirm the terrible truth that was clawing at my insides. "Don't look." But I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't help it. I turned my head, my eyes locking onto the rearview mirror. My breath caught in my throat. Nothing. There was nothing behind me. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and silent, just the faint hum of the engine breaking the stillness. No footsteps. No shadow. No figure. I stared at the mirror for what felt like an eternity, my pulse racing, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was deafening. My heart slowed, but my body was still rigid with fear. But then, just as I thought I was free, just as I thought I had escaped whatever was chasing me, I heard it again. A voice. Soft at first, like the whisper of a breeze, but then it grew louder, clearer. Turn around. I froze, the words seeping into my mind, pulling at my thoughts, urging me to obey. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look. But the voice was so powerful, so demanding, that I couldn't fight it anymore. Against every instinct in my body, I turned my head. In the back seat, sitting calmly as though it had always been there, was a figure. The same hollow-eyed face from before. It was watching me, its twisted smile curling at the corners of its lips. Its eyes, those black, empty eyes, locked onto mine, and in them I saw something terrible, something ancient, something beyond human. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. It was already in my mind, already wrapping its presence around me, controlling me. Stay with us, it said, its voice now thick with an unnatural power, like it was speaking directly into my soul. Forever. I couldn't breathe. The words lodged themselves in my throat, choking me. My heart raced, each beat a thundering drum in my ears. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape them. I had been pulled into their web, and now there was no way out. I slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The figure in the back seat didn't move, but I felt its presence even more now. It was inside the car with me, inside my head, inside my very being. I should have gotten out. I should have run. But my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The air in the car turned cold, freezing, and the shadows inside seemed to stretch and twist, warping the interior of the vehicle. The figure leaned forward, its face inches from mine, its breath cold on my skin. "Come," it whispered again. "You are ours." And then, the final truth hit me, there was no escape. The forest had already claimed me. There was no way out, no way to run. I had already become part of the darkness. The last thing I heard before the world went black was the sound of footsteps, slowly, steadily, approaching. And then silence. Complete silence. I woke up. The sensation was strange, slow, as though I were pulling myself out of a deep, suffocating fog. My head was heavy, my body cold, and every muscle felt like it had been dragged through a nightmare. I tried to move, but my limbs were sluggish, as though they didn't belong to me anymore. I blinked into the darkness. The air was thick, still, and oppressive. I was no longer in the car. I wasn't anywhere familiar. I didn't know where I was. A soft whisper floated through the air, familiar. It was the same voice, the one that had led me into the forest, the one that had echoed in my mind, the one that had pulled me into the dark. Stay. The word was soft, almost tender, like a lullaby. But it carried an underlying weight, a truth buried deep beneath the surface. My heart hammered in my chest as my mind raced, trying to make sense of the overwhelming sense of wrongness that surrounded me. I forced myself to sit up, but the effort left me dizzy. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I saw the outlines of trees, thick and looming, surrounding me on all sides. The ground beneath me was soft, the soil damp with the chill of night. The same forest. The same nightmare. But something was different now. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They were alive. They shifted, their trunks twisting in unnatural directions, their branches curling like hands, reaching out. And there, in the distance, I saw it, the figure. It was standing just beyond the trees, still and silent, its hollow eyes glowing in the dark. It had been waiting. I could feel it in the air. The forest wasn't just a place, it was an entity, alive and watching, every corner of it, every leaf, every rustle a part of something far darker than I had ever imagined. I had been swallowed whole, consumed by something that had no mercy, no understanding of what it meant to be human. The figure began to move toward me, its steps deliberate and slow, its form gliding through the shadows like it was part of the very night itself. My heart froze, and I scrambled to my feet, panic flooding my veins. I couldn't run. There was no point. I had already entered the web, already become part of this twisted world. Stay with us. The voice wrapped itself around me again, curling like smoke, drawing me toward the figure. My legs moved on their own, dragging me closer, even as every part of me screamed to turn back. But there was no turning back. I tried to speak, to ask questions, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat. I could feel them, the voices, hundreds of them, thousands of them, all whispering at once, calling to me from the trees, from the darkness, from the very air itself. Why? I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. The figure stopped just in front of me, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought I saw something beyond the emptiness in its gaze, something human. But it was fleeting, gone before I could fully comprehend it. You are part of us now, the figure said, its voice a guttural rasp, like the sound of earth breaking apart. I didn't understand. How could I? How could anyone understand the twisted logic of a world like this? The forest, the figures, the whispers, all of it, it was beyond comprehension. The darkness had consumed everything, and I had become just another piece in its ever-expanding grip. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight, to claw my way back to reality. But my body wouldn't obey. The forest was in control now, and I was just a puppet in its endless, malevolent game. I looked around, desperate for a way out. The trees, the shadows, they were closing in. The space around me was shrinking, narrowing, until there was nothing but the figure standing before me, its eyes never leaving mine. And then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Soft at first, but growing louder. A slow, deliberate pace that matched the rhythm of my heart. But these footsteps weren't coming from the figure. They were coming from all around me, from the trees, from the shadows. There were others here. Others who had been drawn into this place, just like I had. And now they were a part of it, too. I turned in a panic, trying to see who, what, was following me. But the darkness was thick, consuming everything in its path. I saw nothing. And then, the voices. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were a chorus, a flood of sound that overwhelmed me. Hundreds of voices, all saying the same thing. The same word. Stay. The ground beneath me trembled, and the trees groaned as if they were alive, responding to the call. I felt the weight of the forest, the weight of whatever it was that had taken hold of me, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. And then, through the darkness, I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows. hundreds of them, all with the same hollow eyes, the same twisted smiles. They were the others, the ones who had been here before me. The ones who had stayed. And I understood. There was no escaping this place. No escaping the forest. No escaping the voices, the whispers, the darkness. I wasn't just lost. I was part of it now. I had always been part of it. Stay. The last thing I heard before everything faded to black was the sound of footsteps. Thousands of them. All marching in time with my own. And then, nothing. Just the silence of the forest. Forever. The street with the red doors. It started with a single door. I noticed it on my walk home, tucked between two old houses, its presence almost out of place. The door was bright red, the color almost too vibrant for the otherwise dull street. I stood in front of it for a moment, unsure what to think. It was just a door. But there was something unsettling about it, something that I couldn't put my finger on. The way it stood there, on a quiet suburban street in Pennsylvania, untouched and alone, just didn't sit right with me. The street was familiar to me, the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened. Neighbors waved from their porches, kids played on their bikes, and the sound of lawnmowers hummed softly in the distance. But that door felt different. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It wasn't anything. Just a door. Yet, as I passed by, I couldn't help but feel like someone, or something, was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickened my pace and tried not to glance back, but I couldn't stop myself. That red door was still there, waiting. The next day, I passed by it again. This time, the door was wide open. I froze for a second, my heart skipping a beat. No one was there, at least not that I could see. The house behind it looked empty, the windows dark, the lawn slightly overgrown. There had never been a red door here before. I was certain of it. But the house seemed different now, like it had always been there, like it was a part of the neighborhood's history, even though I knew it wasn't. Curiosity pulled at me. I walked closer, despite the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. The door beckoned, as if daring me to come inside. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, and I could hear nothing but the distant hum of traffic, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. The street, usually so full of life, seemed unusually quiet now. I took a tentative step forward, just a few inches, my eyes never leaving the door. I reached for the handle, almost as if I were drawn to it, not by choice, but by something far more powerful. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the handle, and I paused. Why was I doing this? I thought, suddenly aware of how strange it was to be standing here at all. But there was a pull, something inside me was telling me to open it, to see what was beyond. But something stopped me. A voice. Or maybe it was just my own mind, whispering warnings. Don't, it seemed to say. I stepped back, away from the door, my pulse quickening. I turned and walked away, not looking back again. But that feeling, that unnerving presence, lingered. I couldn't shake it. It was like the street itself had changed, become something unfamiliar. As I reached my house, I glanced at my neighbors' homes. Everything looked the same except the door. It had spread. Every house had a red door now. A brilliant red, standing out against the dull facades of otherwise ordinary homes. Every door was wide open, just like the first one. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet refused to move. What is happening? The door to my own house wasn't the usual Warrenwood I'd come to know. It had changed too, red, as bright and stark as the others. I didn't understand. It felt wrong, like the world around me had shifted, and I had been left behind. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking, and rushed inside. I slammed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, trying to catch my breath. I took a step back, looking around my home as if seeing it for the first time. Everything was in its place. The familiar smells of the kitchen, the faint hum of the fridge, the soft glow of the lamps in the living room. But the house didn't feel the same anymore. The air seemed thicker, somehow. I felt like I was being suffocated, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. I moved to the window and peeked outside. The street was empty. The neighbors' red doors were closed now, but I knew they were still there. Still waiting. And I knew, in that moment, that I couldn't ignore this any longer. The doors were more than just doors. They were a sign of something. Something that had come to this street and to all of us. I didn't want to open my door. I didn't want to know what was beyond it. But the question lingered in my mind. What happens if you open the door? The question gnawed at me, louder than the silence of my home. I felt a sudden compulsion to go back outside, to test it. But as I reached for the door, a shiver ran down my spine. What if I was already too late? I stood frozen, my hand hovering just above the red door. For a moment, I was paralyzed by the weight of it all, the unanswered questions, the eerie presence that seemed to hang in the air like an invisible fog. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat beginning to form on the back of my neck. There was no rational explanation for what was happening. The red doors, every house on the block had one now. Not just any red, but a vibrant, almost unnatural shade, like blood, like fire. They had all appeared overnight, and with them came that unsettling quiet, that feeling that something was terribly wrong. I wanted to turn away, to forget it. But I couldn't. My eyes were glued to the door, and the question, what happens if you open it, screamed in my mind. What would I find on the other side? Could I even escape it if I knew? I stepped back, taking a deep breath, trying to collect my thoughts. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. But my mind kept racing, spiraling deeper. What was I supposed to do? Should I just ignore it, like everyone else seemed to be doing? Act like nothing had changed? I glanced out the window once more, looking at the row of red doors. Some of my neighbors had returned to their normal routines, standing on their porches, going about their day. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. But I knew better now. Nothing was the same. A sound startled me, a knock. A sharp rap against my door. I froze, staring at the wood. My hand was still inches away from the handle. I hadn't heard anyone approach, hadn't seen any shadow through the frosted glass. How could there be someone there? The knock came again, more insistent this time. Should I open it? The thought hung in the air, unanswered, heavy. My mind raced as I wondered who it could be. Was it just someone from the neighborhood coming over to check on me? Maybe they had noticed my hesitation, my anxiety, and wanted to make sure I was okay. But that seemed so out of place. Why would anyone knock like this, at a time like this? Another knock, louder this time, almost desperate. I jumped, my hand jerking away from the door. I looked around the room, suddenly feeling claustrophobic. The house was too quiet now, the stillness unbearable. The only sound was the soft pounding of my heart and the relentless knocking, which now seemed to echo in my ears. I didn't move. I couldn't move. A part of me told me to call someone, to ask what was happening, but another part, the darker part of me, whispered that it would do no good. No one would come. No one would understand. The knocking stopped. Silence. I dared to glance back at the door, my breath shallow. But as I stared at the polished red surface, I felt something I hadn't expected, a presence, a pull, a suffocating force that seemed to emanate from the very wood. It was like the door had become something more, something alive. The cold in the air deepened. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath, visible in the stillness. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my spine stiffening. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, to do anything but stay. But I couldn't move. My legs were like lead, my body trapped by something beyond my understanding. Then, a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, clear and soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Open it," it said, the words sending a chill straight through me. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was an order. And something about the way it was spoken made me feel like I had no choice but to obey. I felt my hand moving, involuntarily, reaching for the door handle once again. My body acted before my mind could catch up. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know. But my fingers curled around the cold metal, turning it, the sound of the latch clicking echoing in the silence. The door creaked open. Slowly. Reluctantly. Beyond the door was nothing. Just blackness. No streetlights. No familiar outline of the neighbor's house. Just an empty void, like looking into the heart of some unnameable abyss. A gust of wind swept through the doorway, cold and sharp, pushing against me. I stumbled back, nearly falling, but my eyes couldn't leave the darkness that stretched before me. It was like the door led nowhere, no outside world, no street, no safety. It was just empty. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. But then I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like the flutter of paper in the wind. But it grew louder. It wasn't just one sound. It was voices. Low, murmuring voices, coming from deep within the blackness, swirling around like whispers that refused to be ignored. They were all saying the same thing. Come inside. My heart pounded. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like a choir of unseen figures calling to me from beyond the door. The air seemed to hum with energy, pulling at me, urging me forward. I staggered backward, heart racing in my chest. What was this? What was happening? Why was I even considering it? But the door, it called to me. It wasn't just an opening to another world, it was a promise. A force. Something that had power over me. Something that had power over all of us. I slammed the door shut, the sound deafening in the silent house. I leaned against it, panting, my body trembling. My mind screamed, but it was drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I looked back out the window. The red doors were still there, all of them, closed, waiting. And I realized with a sinking feeling that there was no escaping this. There was no running from the doors, from whatever they represented. They were a part of the street, a part of us. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they would always be there, just beyond reach. Waiting for the next person to open them. Waiting for the next voice to call. I spent the rest of the night in a haze, my mind spinning with questions, each one darker than the last. I couldn't shake the images from my head, the door opening into that vast, impenetrable darkness, the whispers that seemed to echo in the very air. I wanted to sleep, to forget, but I couldn't. Every corner of my house felt wrong, like the walls were closing in, like the space around me was too small, too suffocating. I kept thinking about the voices. They had been so clear, so real. But they weren't from outside. They came from inside the door, from that place beyond it, and even now, I could still hear them in the back of my mind. I couldn't escape them. They followed me, whispered in my ears when I tried to rest, when I tried to push them away. The morning came, but the sun didn't feel as warm as it used to. The air was still heavy, oppressive. I pulled myself out of bed, still tired, but I couldn't stay there. I had to do something. I had to know what was going on. The street outside was quiet, almost too quiet. It was the kind of morning where everything felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I looked down the block. The red doors were still there, closed now, like nothing had ever happened. Like nothing had changed. But I knew better. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to do something, anything, to make sense of all this. As I walked down the street, my mind raced. What were the doors? Where had they come from? Why had they appeared overnight, on every house, on every block? And what did they mean? I couldn't stop thinking about the people who had opened them. Had they disappeared, like the whispers had promised? Were they lost somewhere in that abyss behind the door? I reached the first house on the block, the one with the red door that had started it all. The door was shut now, but I felt it, the same pull, the same pressure I had felt the day before. It was as if the door was watching me, waiting for me to come closer, to open it. I stopped in front of it, my breath shallow, my heart racing. There was no sign of anyone here. No one was outside, no one was walking by. The street felt emptier than ever. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather the courage to open it, to face whatever lay beyond. But then, a sound broke the silence. A voice, familiar and distant, echoed from behind the door. Don't be afraid. Come inside. It was a woman's voice, soft and inviting, but it sent a chill straight through me. I recognized it, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't anyone I knew, at least not consciously. Yet, it felt like something that had been waiting for me, something that I had always known but never understood. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The voice was real. I wasn't imagining it. It was coming from inside the house. I turned away quickly, my mind screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But as I turned, my gaze fell on the next house down the block. Its red door stood open, and I could see the faintest movement from the other side, like a shadow shifting within the darkness. I froze. I couldn't help it. I had to know. I walked toward the door, my feet moving before my mind could catch up. I was closer now, the soft whisper of my footsteps barely audible over the rushing in my ears. The door seemed to draw me in, like a magnet, like it was pulling me toward it, toward the unknown. I reached the threshold and stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the fear that gripped my chest. The air around me was thick now, almost electric, charged with something I couldn't identify. The whispers were louder here, the voices swirling around me like a storm, like a tide rising, pulling me under. Come inside. It's safe. It's the only way. The voice was soothing now, soft and sweet, but I could feel the warning beneath it. It's the only way. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I had no choice. There was something inside me, something primal, that needed to understand, needed to know what was behind these doors. The answers, the truth, it was all behind them. I had to go through, no matter the cost. I stepped inside. The darkness enveloped me immediately, swallowing the street, the houses, everything I had known. The air was thick, heavy with a strange warmth, like a humid night that had never cooled. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the walls around me, the floor beneath my feet. It was like stepping into another world, one that existed just beyond the veil of this one. I took a tentative step forward. My breath echoed in the silence, but I couldn't hear anything else. No voices. No whispers. Just the thick, suffocating air. Then, a figure appeared in front of me. Tall, shadowed, featureless. I stepped back, my heart racing. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. Slowly, it lifted its hand, pointing towards something behind me. I turned. There, just beyond my reach, was another door. Red, like all the others. But this one was different. The handle was blackened, almost burnt, as if it had been touched by something far too powerful for me to comprehend. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. I was already too far in. The door, it was calling to me, just like all the others. And as I reached out to touch the handle, I realized, too late, that there was no going back. The door wasn't just a passage to another room. It was a doorway to the end. I turned the handle. The door creaked open, and a wave of intense cold rushed toward me. The sudden chill froze my breath, making it hang in the air like mist. My heart raced as the darkness beyond the threshold seemed to stretch out endlessly, swallowing the faint light that had been there moments before. I stood on the edge, teetering between two worlds, the one I knew and the one that had been hidden just out of sight, waiting for me to walk into it. As my fingers gripped the handle, I felt something deep within me snap. A part of me wanted to turn around, to run as fast and as far as I could, to forget everything I had seen and heard, to pretend that this was just some twisted nightmare. But the pull was too strong. I couldn't stop now. I stepped through the door. The air shifted. The temperature dropped further, and the very ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, as though I were walking on something that wasn't solid. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse. But I didn't. I steadied myself and forced my eyes open. What I saw beyond the door wasn't a room, wasn't a hallway. It wasn't even a world I recognized. It was a void. A vast, endless emptiness that stretched infinitely in all directions, like the space between stars, silent, cold, and far too deep. The edges of the world seemed to blur together, as though reality itself was warping and distorting. The very fabric of existence felt fragile here, as if it could tear apart at any moment. And then, I saw them. Figures, moving slowly in the distance. At first, I thought they were shadows, but as I focused, I could see that they were people, or at least, they resembled people. They were draped in dark, shifting robes that seemed to float, weightless, around their forms. Their faces were hidden, obscured by darkness, or perhaps by something deeper, something darker than I could comprehend. They were the ones who had disappeared. The ones who had opened the doors before me. I could feel them watching me, though their faces remained hidden. I could hear their whispers, soft at first, but then growing louder, filling the air around me like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You shouldn't have come," they murmured. "Now you are one of us." I tried to move, to turn back, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, my body no longer my own. I wanted to scream, to beg them to let me go, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I could only hear their voices in my head, urging me forward, pulling me deeper into the void. One figure stepped closer. The sound of its footfalls echoed like a distant drumbeat. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its movement was fluid, almost too smooth, as if it were gliding rather than walking. As it came closer, the darkness surrounding it seemed to ripple and shimmer, like an ocean disturbed by an unseen force. It reached out, a long, pale hand stretching toward me. Its fingers were elongated, too long to be human, but they moved with an unsettling grace. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that it was reaching for me, for my soul, not my body. It was an invitation to become one of them, to step fully into this dark, void-like existence. "Don't touch me!" I screamed inside my head, but my voice was lost, swallowed by the silence. The figure paused, its hand inches from my face. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, like it was waiting for something, some sign of my submission, my acceptance. And then, something inside me broke. A part of me that had been fighting, struggling to hold on to who I was, collapsed. The truth of it all hit me like a wave. I had never been meant to escape. I was always meant to be here. The doors had opened for me because they knew me, because I had been chosen. I stepped forward. The moment my foot touched the ground, everything shifted. The void stretched even further, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled my mind completely. I could no longer hear myself think. My thoughts were drowned out by the cacophony of voices, 1,000 souls lost in the dark, calling out, urging me to join them, to become one of them. I felt my body change, slowly, as if I were shedding my skin, my humanity. The air thickened around me, filling my lungs with something unnatural. I could feel my soul slipping away, dissolving into the darkness, merging with the others, becoming one with them. And then, there was nothing. I opened my eyes, or I think I did. I wasn't sure anymore. The door, the street, the world, I couldn't remember any of it. All I knew now was the weight of the darkness surrounding me, the endless void that stretched out in all directions. The voices were silent, the figures were still, but I was no longer me. I was part of them. I could feel it, deep inside. A presence, a collective consciousness, all the lost souls who had opened the doors before me, now bound together in this strange, endless place. And as I stood there, lost in the cold expanse of this dark world, I understood. The doors were never meant to lead to escape. They were never meant to let you go. They were the beginning of the end. The door had taken me. And now, I was one of the many waiting for the next soul to open it. Shadows of the old tunnel. The screeching of the train echoed through the dark tunnels beneath Chicago, its usual rhythmic pulse interrupted by the unnatural silence that had started to settle over the subway system. It was the kind of silence that made you uneasy, the kind that wrapped itself around your thoughts and made you question whether you were really alone. I had noticed it for a while, these strange quiet moments on the trains when everything seemed to hold its breath. I had been working late at the office, like always, and now I was catching the last train home. The platform was almost empty, the flickering lights casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. I glanced at my watch, just after midnight. The usual crowd had long since disappeared, and only a few commuters were left, their tired faces lit by the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights overhead. I pulled out my phone to check the time again, half distracted, when I noticed something odd, a figure standing at the far end of the platform, just beyond the reach of the lights. I could barely make out the outline of the person, but something about their stillness sent a shiver up my spine. They stood motionless, not moving an inch, as if they were waiting for something or someone. I shook my head, brushing off the creeping unease. Probably just another tired commuter, I thought. It was late, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the train arrived, and the figure was gone. The train doors opened with a groan, and I stepped inside, finding an empty car. I slid into a seat by the window and watched as the city passed by in flashes of light, shadows, and the blur of motion. It was a familiar routine until the train passed an old section of the tracks, where the tunnels stretched deep and the flickering lights barely illuminated the path ahead. I heard a noise behind me, a faint shuffle. I turned around, but the car was empty. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. But then, the train suddenly jerked forward as if something had made it shudder. I glanced down the aisle again, my heart beginning to race. The emptiness felt wrong. It was as though the space itself was holding its breath. And then it happened. A sudden, sharp scream echoed through the train, a sound so guttural, so desperate, that it seemed to come from the very walls of the tunnel itself. I jumped to my feet, my pulse pounding in my ears, as the train sped through the darkness. The scream faded, and I sat back down, my hands trembling. I told myself it was just a figment of my imagination, or maybe someone else on the train playing a prank. But the uneasy feeling didn't leave. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the dimly lit tunnel ahead. The train came to a stop at the next station, and I noticed that the lights in the car flickered more than usual. The doors opened, but no one stepped in. I felt a chill. The doors closed again, but just as the train began to move, I saw a shadow at the end of the car. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, but there was something about it, something wrong. It moved, slipping between the shadows, like a presence that shouldn't be there. I could feel my breath quicken, and my heart pounded in my chest as the train rumbled down the tracks. The shadow was gone, but the lingering sense of dread remained, thick in the air like a warning I couldn't ignore. When the train reached the next station, the doors opened, and I watched, almost as if in slow motion, as a passenger stepped onto the platform only to disappear. No, not disappear. Vanish. Like the air itself had swallowed them whole. I jumped out of my seat, rushing toward the doors. The platform was empty. No one else was there. I glanced down the tunnel and saw nothing but the stretch of darkness, a yawning abyss. That's when I heard it, the soft, almost imperceptible shuffle of footsteps, not from the station, but from the depths of the tunnel. Something was coming toward me, something far too silent to be human. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What the hell is going on? I couldn't stop myself from glancing back toward the tunnel, my hands gripping the seat. Was it just the darkness playing tricks on me, or was there something in the tunnel that shouldn't be there? The train began to move again, its wheels scraping against the tracks as it made its way deeper into the unknown. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. And then, another scream, this time, closer. I looked out the window, the city lights flashing past in the distance. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the reflection of the glass, a dark figure, standing just behind me, its face hidden in shadow. But when I turned, there was nothing there. The train rattled on, deeper into the tunnels, where the lights seemed to fade, and the air grew colder. It was then I realized I wasn't just afraid of the dark. I was afraid of what lived in it. The train jolted again, a harsh grinding sound that reverberated through the car, snapping me out of my daze. The lights flickered, plunging the car into darkness for a split second before they returned, casting a sickly yellow glow across the interior. I blinked rapidly, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The train continued its monotonous journey, but the unease that had taken root in my chest was now a heavy weight, suffocating me with every passing second. I glanced at my phone, hoping for some semblance of normalcy, a distraction. The screen lit up briefly, but the signal was lost. The familiar no-service message blinked in the corner, only adding to my sense of isolation. Was I imagining things? I kept telling myself that this was just a late-night anxiety trip, nothing more. The darkness outside, the empty train, the unnerving silence, it was all a byproduct of the hour, nothing to be afraid of. But the whisper of footsteps from the tunnel, now louder than before, clung to my thoughts, and the images of that vanishing passenger kept replaying in my mind. What happened to them? Where did they go? The train slowed to a stop at the next station. I didn't want to get off. I didn't want to be anywhere near that platform. But the doors opened, and a man stepped into the car. He was tall, dressed in an old, faded trench coat, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. I couldn't see his eyes, but the way he moved, slow, deliberate, as if the very air in the car had become too thick to pass through, made my skin crawl. He didn't acknowledge anyone, didn't even glance at the other passengers who were, like me, glued to their seats, staring ahead as if they couldn't look away from the terror that gripped us all. I couldn't breathe. The man took a seat a few rows away from me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I felt his presence like a weight pressing on my chest, suffocating me with its intensity. My hands clenched the armrests, my knuckles white as the train started moving again. I glanced back toward the doors, hoping the station would appear soon, hoping I could get off this nightmare ride. But the tunnel stretched on, dark and endless. Why was the man here? I turned back to him, trying to act casual, but when my eyes met his, I froze. His face was covered in shadows, but I could swear I saw something in the depths of his eyes. Not human eyes, but something hollow, empty. The air grew colder, a chill seeping into my bones. I looked away, but the sensation of his gaze burned into me. My breathing quickened, and the train seemed to slow again, as though it were somehow stretching time itself. I needed to get off. But when I turned back to the door, my heart sank. The platform had disappeared. There was nothing but the blackness of the tunnel ahead. The man was still there, staring at me, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, only this time, they didn't come back. The train was plunged into darkness, and the screeching of the tracks seemed to grow louder, more distorted, like something was pulling at the very fabric of reality itself. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the sound of the train grinding against the tracks, and I was alone in the darkness, utterly alone. I could feel something move, something closer now, closer than the man. The air around me grew thick, as if the tunnel itself had come alive, its walls pressing in from all sides. The cold seeped into my bones, and I saw it, the shadow, just beyond the train car. It was tall, shapeless, but its presence was undeniable. It wasn't like a normal shadow. It moved with a fluidity that defied the laws of light, slipping in and out of view, like something not meant to be seen at all. I looked around frantically. The other passengers were gone. The train car was empty, save for me and the figure standing in the dark. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady as I stumbled down the aisle. I had to get out. I had to get off this train before it took me too. The doors wouldn't open. I pulled at the emergency handle, but it was stuck, frozen as if the train had already been claimed by whatever was lurking in the tunnels. The shadow grew closer, its form twisting and distorting like it was made of smoke, its presence bending the space around it. Then it spoke. A whisper, faint and distant, but undeniably real. "You shouldn't have come." I froze. The words came from all directions, as if the train itself were speaking. My head spun, and I backed away from the shadow, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind raced. Was this some sort of hallucination? A nightmare? But the fear that gripped me felt too real, too present, to be a dream. Suddenly, the shadow lunged, and I was consumed by darkness. In that instant, I realized I wasn't just afraid of the dark. I was afraid of what hunted within it. I don't remember exactly when the darkness consumed me. It felt like I was falling, slipping into an abyss where time and space no longer existed. My body seemed weightless, my senses dull and detached. The panic in my chest, the rapid beating of my heart, was the only thing that felt real in that endless void. When the blackness finally receded, I was no longer in the train. I was standing in a small, dimly lit hallway, its walls made of aged stone that looked like they had not seen the light of day for decades. The air was thick with dust, the musty smell of old, forgotten places. My feet echoed on the floor as I took a step forward, but the sound was distorted, as if the space around me were warped. I tried to breathe, but the air felt wrong, dense, thick, as though it was stifling me with every inhalation. The walls seemed to press in on me, and every shadow around me twisted unnaturally, as though they were alive. I tried to move, but something in the back of my mind told me that I shouldn't. I could feel it, the sensation of being watched, the weight of eyes staring at me from the corners of the room, from the black spaces between the walls. The whispering started again, low at first, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew louder. "Leave. Leave now." I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the endless hallway stretching in both directions, each turn shrouded in darkness. The whisper grew urgent. "Leave. Before it sees you." I froze. My chest tightened as I tried to process the words. What was it? Who was it? The fear in my gut twisted and coiled tighter, choking off any rational thought. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and yet, somehow, it was closing in on me. I could feel the weight of something terrible behind me, creeping closer. Something dark, something that didn't belong in this world. I turned again, desperately searching for an escape, but the hallway, it was different. The walls seemed to shift, the patterns of the stones rearranging themselves like they were alive, breathing. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, a low rumble that shook through my body. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. The sound grew louder, closer, each step reverberating in my skull. It was coming for me. I had to move. I had to get out of here. But where? The hallway stretched on, and the darkness seemed to multiply with each step. The light that had dimmed now flickered, as if it were losing its battle against the shadows. The footsteps drew nearer, the unmistakable sound of heavy boots dragging across the stone floor. The air was thick with the sound of breathing, something ragged, something unnatural. I could feel the presence closing in, could hear the weight of it in the very air around me. It was too late to outrun it. I spun around, my mind racing for an escape, but the hallway had disappeared. The space I was in, this nightmare, had no way out. The walls closed in on me, and I could hear it now, the scraping of claws against stone, the rustling of something too large and too awful to comprehend. I wasn't alone. It was here. A low growl echoed from the dark, and then a shadow appeared in the periphery of my vision, tall, humanoid, but distorted, its limbs too long, too thin, its skin pale and slick, like something that had never seen light. Its face, though, I couldn't make it out. There were no features, just a mass of shifting shadows, a blackness so deep it threatened to swallow me whole. The growl turned into a low hiss, a sound that vibrated in my chest. I felt its gaze on me, cold and empty, like it knew everything about me, everything I had ever feared. "You're too late," it whispered, the voice like 100 voices woven together, each one dripping with malice. "Now, you're mine." My heart pounded in my chest, my body frozen with terror. I could feel its presence all around me now, its cold, suffocating touch that threatened to swallow me whole. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, tight. There was no escape. There was nowhere to run. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the darkness seemed to fold in on itself, and the creature was gone. I stood there, trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The hallway was silent again, the walls untouched, the air still and heavy. But the feeling remained, the knowledge that I was not alone. Something was there, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. And as I slowly turned, my heart sinking deeper into my stomach, I saw it, the tunnel behind me. It was not a tunnel of stone or light. It was a tunnel of nothingness. I was falling, again. I tried to scream again, but the sound was swallowed by the silence, absorbed by the oppressive air around me. My mind raced, desperate to find a way out, a way to break free from the horror that surrounded me. But no matter how I turned, no matter how fast I ran, the tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, an endless abyss with no escape. The darkness pressed in from every side, thick and suffocating. I could no longer see the walls, the floor, the ceiling, only the void. A crushing, all-encompassing void that threatened to collapse in on me. My breath was ragged, every inhalation coming in short, panic bursts. The air tasted stale, like death, and my body felt heavier with each passing second, as if the darkness itself were pulling me down into its depths. I stumbled forward, my legs weak and trembling beneath me. The whispering voices started again, this time louder, more insistent, their words indistinct but full of malice. They coiled around my mind, twisting and tangling with my thoughts until I couldn't tell where my fear ended and the voices began. "Leave. Leave now. You don't belong here." I shook my head, trying to banish the whispers from my mind, but they only grew louder, more frantic. I couldn't understand what they were saying, couldn't grasp their meaning, but the terror in their tone was unmistakable. Something was coming. Something was hunting me, waiting for the moment I faltered, waiting for the instant I let my guard down. I could feel its presence now, creeping up behind me, its breath cold against the back of my neck. It was real. The creature, the shadow that had once whispered to me, was here, in the darkness. I could hear its footsteps, the soft scrape of claws against stone, and my stomach twisted with dread. I had to get away. I had to keep moving. But with each step, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that the tunnel was alive, that the walls were shifting, closing in on me. The space around me warped, distorted, and I felt my mind begin to unravel under the strain. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The tunnel seemed endless, its twists and turns a maze of confusion. There was no sense of direction, no sense of time. All I could do was keep moving forward, hoping that somehow, somewhere, there was an exit, a way out of this nightmare. And then I saw it. A flicker of light, a soft, pulsing glow in the distance. I stumbled toward it, hope surging in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the way out. Maybe this light was the answer, the escape I had been searching for. But as I drew closer, the light grew dimmer, flickering like a dying flame. The shadows around me deepened, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. I was close now, so close. But something in the back of my mind told me that this light was a trap, that it was pulling me deeper into the abyss. The light vanished. I was plunged back into darkness. The weight of the shadows pressed down on me, suffocating me, wrapping around me like cold, invisible hands. I felt myself falling again, tumbling through the void with no ground beneath me, no way to stop. My heart raced, my mind spiraling into panic as I reached out, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. And then, with a sickening lurch, I hit the ground. The impact knocked the air from my lungs, and I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, unable to move. My body felt numb, as though it had been shattered by the fall. My chest ached with each breath, and my limbs felt heavy, sluggish. But the worst part, the most terrifying part, was the silence. The whispers were gone. The footsteps had stopped. I was alone. I didn't dare move, didn't dare open my eyes. I knew, instinctively, that if I did, I would be trapped again. Whatever had been chasing me was still out there, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for me to slip up. I could feel its presence in the air, cold and oppressive, a dark weight pressing down on me. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. The silence around me was so thick, so complete, that it became deafening. My senses were on high alert, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, to get away, to find an escape before it was too late. But there was no escape. I had realized, too late, that the tunnel was not just a place. It was a trap that had no exit, no escape. I could feel it again, the presence, the weight of its eyes upon me. Something was watching, waiting for me to move. I could hear the faintest of breaths, the softest of whispers, creeping along the edges of my mind. It was coming. And this time, there was no way out. "You're mine now." The words echoed in my mind, the voice cold and final. And then, I heard it. The first step. A single, deliberate sound echoing in the silence. It was getting closer. The step echoed again, closer this time. My pulse quickened, the rhythm of my heartbeat now the only sound I could hear as it thudded painfully in my ears. My breath caught in my throat, a cold sweat forming along my skin despite the unnatural chill in the air. I couldn't move, couldn't even bring myself to open my eyes. The darkness had become a suffocating cocoon, and the terror of knowing something was there, so close, was worse than anything I had experienced. The silence stretched between the footfalls, the anticipation building like a slow-burning fuse. It was getting closer, there was no denying it. The steps were methodical, deliberate, each one a reminder that I was not alone, that I had never been alone in this tunnel. I had thought I was just running from a monster, something tangible, something I could confront. But now I realized that the true horror was not what I could fight, but what I could never understand, never truly escape. I could feel the weight of its presence before I even saw it. My chest tightened as the shadows around me seemed to grow deeper, more oppressive, until it felt as though the air itself was thick with malevolence. I opened my eyes, but all I could see was pitch black, a void that swallowed everything in its path. There was no distinction between the ground and the air, the walls and the ceiling. Everything had dissolved into a haze of darkness. And then, in the distance, there was a flicker. A movement. A shadow. A shape that didn't belong. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form shifting, bending, as though it were not fully solid, not fully real. It was a silhouette that seemed to stretch and contort with each step it took toward me, its features a blur, like a distorted reflection in water. I couldn't make out its face. There was no face. Only an empty void where its features should have been. I gasped, my breath ragged, as the shape moved closer. I could feel the pressure in the air intensify, as though the very atmosphere was growing denser with each passing second. The shadows seemed to writhe, crawling up the walls, twisting around me like serpents. I could feel them, feel their cold tendrils brushing against my skin, their chilling presence enveloping me. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. It was as if my very will to survive had been drained, leaving me empty, helpless. The figure was now inches away from me, and I could feel its cold, invisible gaze upon me. There was no sound, no whisper, no warning, only the presence of something that was not meant to be, something that had no place in the world of the living. It was death. It was the shadow of something that should never have existed. And then, the voice. A whisper. A slow, methodical murmur, like a breath from the abyss itself. You should have stayed away. The words cut through the silence, sharp and final. The air seemed to crack with their power. They didn't just come from the figure, they came from the very walls, from the darkness itself. They surrounded me, smothered me, until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't escape. It reached out. Not with hands, not with claws, but with the void. The shadow twisted around me, cold and suffocating, pulling me into its grasp, its embrace. My vision blurred, my thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. My mind screamed, desperate to escape, but my body refused to move, paralyzed by the overwhelming darkness. I felt my body being dragged, pulled deeper into the void, deeper into the shadow. The walls closed in, the tunnel becoming narrower, more suffocating, until there was no space left, no air, no light. Only the shadow and the whispers that surrounded me. It's too late. And then, with a jolt, the tunnel vanished. The shadow was all that was left. It consumed me whole, swallowing my screams, swallowing my very existence. There was nothing left of me but the darkness. No memory, no name, no past. I had become a part of it. A shadow in the tunnel. And the tunnel would never let me go. The Black Forest. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the rugged landscape of Colorado. I stood at the edge of the forest, the tall pines looming before me like silent sentinels guarding some ancient secret. I had heard the stories, of course, everyone who lived near these woods had. The Black Forest was a place of legends, whispered about in hushed tones. People went in, but they never came out. Some said it was the land itself, cursed by some long-forgotten force. Others claimed it was something more sinister, a force that fed on the living, trapping them in an eternal embrace of darkness. I didn't believe it. Not at first. I had grown up in the town near these woods, my family living on the outskirts where the forests met the wild mountain terrain. I had played in these woods as a child, explored every nook and cranny, never once feeling the slightest hint of fear. But now, standing here as an adult, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The air felt colder, the wind carried an unnatural stillness, and the forest itself seemed to watch me, its ancient trees bending and swaying as though they were alive, aware of my presence. I glanced down at the worn map in my hands, the one that had brought me here. I had heard of a group of hikers who had disappeared a few months ago, vanished without a trace. Their last known location was deep within the Black Forest, and their families had begged for answers, but none had come. As a journalist, I saw this as an opportunity, a story that needed telling, but now, standing on the edge of the forest, I wasn't so sure. There was no denying it, the forest was different. I could feel it in my bones, the strange pull that urged me to venture deeper, to understand the mystery that had haunted this place for centuries. "Come on, what are you afraid of?" I muttered to myself, taking a deep breath and stepping forward. The forest seemed to sigh as I entered, the trees creaking, their branches bending under the weight of the unseen. The path was overgrown with thick moss and twisted roots that seemed to reach out and grab at my feet. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became. The sound of the world beyond the trees faded, swallowed by the silence of the forest. There was no chirping of birds, no rustling of leaves in the breeze. Just the sound of my own footsteps crunching against the forest floor. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of the trees, every whisper of the wind seemed to carry a warning. I stopped, scanning the trees around me, but saw nothing. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Was it just my imagination? I shook my head, trying to clear the doubt from my mind. There were logical explanations for everything. The missing hikers could have gotten lost, trapped, or worse. But that didn't explain the stories, the reports of strange occurrences, the eerie sounds at night, the feeling of being trapped inside the forest, even when you tried to leave. I took another step forward, my heart beating faster as the shadows around me seemed to deepen. The path twisted and turned, leading me further into the dense woods. The trees grew taller here, their trunks thick and gnarled, as if they had been standing for centuries, untouched by time. And then, I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. Turn back. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one else here. No other hikers, no one for miles. Just me in the forest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling more than I intended. The silence answered me. I took another step, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or my overactive imagination. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, scanning the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was still, silent, as though holding its breath. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something deeper than fear, compelled me to keep going. What's the worst that could happen? I whispered to myself, though even I didn't believe it. The whispering ceased, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The forest had never seemed so vast, so alive, its secrets pressing on me from all sides. I didn't know it yet, but this was the point of no return. The black forest was waiting for me, and it would not let me leave. I continued deeper into the woods, the air growing colder with each step. The sunlight had long since disappeared behind the thick canopy of trees, leaving the forest in an almost impenetrable shadow. It felt as if the world outside the forest no longer existed, as though I had crossed into another realm, one where time had no meaning and the laws of nature were distorted. The whispering voice, now gone, still echoed in my mind, urging me to turn back. But I ignored it. The logical part of my brain told me it was just my fear playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in a forest, a place that could easily trigger a sense of isolation and paranoia. The stories I had heard, the mysterious disappearances, the strange occurrences, those were just that, stories. They weren't real. Or were they? I stumbled over a root, catching myself just before I fell, and realized I had been walking without paying much attention to the path. I stopped, looking around for any sign of where I was. The forest seemed to have changed subtly, the trees now closer together, their branches almost intertwining above my head, forming a canopy so dense that not even the faintest sliver of light could penetrate. The air was thick with moisture, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. I couldn't see the path anymore. The once clear trail had vanished, replaced by tangled underbrush and shadows. Panic clawed at my chest. How had I gotten so deep? I turned around, only to see a wall of trees behind me. The way I had come was gone. The forest stretched out endlessly in every direction. My pulse quickened, my mind racing to make sense of it all. You're lost, I thought, just lost. I tried to convince myself that I could retrace my steps, but the more I looked around, the more everything began to feel unfamiliar. The trees, once towering and majestic, now seemed to press in on me, their bark dark and slick, as though they had absorbed something sinister. There was something wrong about the way they stood, as if they were watching me, waiting. I took a step forward, then another, trying to calm my breathing, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest was silent again, but now it felt oppressive, as though the silence itself was a warning. Every little sound I made, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustling of my jacket, seemed amplified, as though the forest was listening, waiting for me to make a mistake. Suddenly, I heard something different. A soft, scraping sound, like something or someone dragging across the forest floor. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The sound came closer, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, praying it would stop, but it didn't. The noise grew louder, the scraping now accompanied by a soft shuffling, as if something was moving just beyond the trees, hidden from view. My heart hammered in my chest. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. The trees were too thick, the shadows too deep. What is it? I thought desperately. What's out there? Then, as if on cue, the wind picked up, shaking the trees and causing the leaves to rustle. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all, the scraping, the shuffling. But then I saw it. A shadow, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. At first, it was nothing more than a dark blur between the trees. But then it shifted, taking form, a figure, tall and thin, its shape indistinct, but undeniably there. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow didn't move like a person. It slid, almost gliding along the ground, its presence unnatural, wrong. My eyes followed it, unable to look away, even as my instinct screamed at me to run. The figure stopped for a moment, and I thought I saw a pair of eyes gleaming from the darkness, though I couldn't be sure. It's watching me. I stumbled backward, my feet tangled in the roots, and I fell, the breath knocked out of me. For a moment, everything was still, the world held in a breathless silence. But then, from the depths of the forest, I heard it again, the sound of something dragging, something approaching. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Panic surged through me, and I pushed myself to my feet, stumbling over the uneven ground as I tried to find the path again. But the forest had closed in behind me. The trees seemed to bend inwards, creating an almost claustrophobic feeling, as if they were pushing me deeper into their grasp. The sound was closer now. Scraping, dragging, coming for me. My heart raced. The air felt thick with an unseen presence. The very ground beneath me seemed to shift as I ran, desperate for escape. I didn't know which way to go, didn't know if I was heading toward the safety of the outside world or further into the heart of the forest, where it was said no one ever returned. But all I knew was that I had to move. I had to survive. I ran without thinking, driven by nothing but instinct. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the branches of the trees seemed to claw at me as I passed, their sharp edges tearing at my clothes, leaving deep red scratches on my arms. My breath was shallow, ragged, as I tried to push through the ever-encroaching darkness. The sound, the dragging, scraping noise, was still there, persistent, as though something was chasing me, or maybe something was leading me. The forest seemed endless. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing but the looming darkness of the trees. But I could still hear it. The sounds were now unmistakable, slow, methodical, like the movement of something far too large, far too patient. I didn't dare to stop, not for a second. I couldn't afford to. But even as I ran, my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What was that shadow? What was following me? Was it a person? Or something worse? I was beginning to feel like the very forest itself was alive, twisting and shifting around me. The trees, once towering, seemed to move in subtle ways, almost imperceptible, but enough to disorient me further. The path ahead was now barely visible. My feet slipped on wet ground, the mud sucking at my boots, pulling me down with every step. And then, in the distance, I saw it, a faint, dim light. A glow in the distance, too steady to be an illusion. My heart jumped in my chest, and for a moment, hope flickered inside me. A way out. A sign of life. I pushed forward, the light becoming clearer as I stumbled toward it. It was soft, almost ethereal, coming from between the trees. A lantern, perhaps? A campfire? But as I drew closer, the light didn't move. It didn't flicker. It simply was. I slowed down, hesitant now, the fear crawling back under my skin. The sound of scraping was gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. The forest around me had become still, unnaturally still. I stepped forward into the clearing, and the light before me grew stronger. But instead of a lantern or fire, I saw something much more bizarre. There, standing in the middle of the clearing, was a tree, unlike any tree I had ever seen. Its bark was dark, black as coal, and it radiated a faint, pulsating light, almost like the heartbeat of the forest itself. The tree's roots stretched out in every direction, gnarled and twisted, sinking deep into the earth as if trying to hold the forest in place. What was this? Why did it glow? It felt wrong, yet there was something magnetic about it. Something that drew me closer. As I stepped closer, I noticed something else. The ground around the tree was disturbed, as if someone or something had dug into the earth, leaving large, uneven holes that stretched in a wide circle. Something had been moving here, something large, something powerful. I knelt beside the tree, my eyes scanning the ground for any clue as to what it all meant. That's why I saw it. A small, withered piece of cloth, tattered and stained, sticking out from beneath the earth. My heart skipped a beat. Someone had been here. I reached down, pulling the cloth from the dirt. It was old, worn, but unmistakable. A piece of a jacket. It wasn't mine. It was someone else's. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught my eye. The figure. The shadow. It was back, slipping between the trees, moving in my direction with the same unnatural glide, its form darker against the light of the glowing tree. I could feel it now, this presence, closing in on me, the air growing colder, heavier. I had to get away. I had to run. But as I stood, something beneath the ground shifted. The earth groaned, the roots of the tree cracking and twisting, as if something below was waking. The ground trembled. The air felt thick and oppressive. And then, I saw them, figures emerging from the earth, from the roots, from the shadows of the tree. Their shapes were indistinct, hazy, but their presence. I could feel it. A coldness that crawled beneath my skin, creeping into my bones. There were at least 5 of them, moving slowly, their limbs long and twisted, dragging themselves toward me. They had no faces, no defining features, just shadowy forms, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were like specters of the forest, born from the very earth, from the tree itself. No, no, no! My mind screamed. This can't be happening. I turned to run, but the earth seemed to rise up beneath me, the roots stretching outward, tripping me, holding me in place. I struggled, desperate to escape, but the shadows were closing in, surrounding me from every direction. The tree. It was the heart of it all. The source of the forest's power, its pull. Run, a whisper, so faint I almost didn't hear it. A voice, deep and gravelly, like the very voice of the forest. Run, before it's too late. But it was already too late. The shadows were upon me, their cold hands reaching out, pulling me into the darkness, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the pulsing light of the black tree. And then, there was nothing. Just the silence of the forest. Just the shadows. The endless darkness. I woke up in the same place, or at least, it seemed like the same place. The air was damp, colder now, and the ground beneath me was uneven, almost soft. It took me a moment to gather my bearings, to remember where I had been, what had happened. My mind felt foggy, as if I had been submerged in a dream or a nightmare from which I couldn't fully wake up. The last thing I remembered was being surrounded by those shadows. But now, here I was, lying on the ground, untouched, as if the forest had decided to spare me, at least for a moment. I sat up slowly, my body sore, my hands trembling. The forest around me was eerily quiet, unnaturally still. Not a bird chirped. Not a leaf rustled in the breeze. The silence was so thick it pressed against my eardrums as if the world itself was holding its breath. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me. My head spun, and I fell back to the ground. There was something wrong with my body, something I couldn't explain. A heaviness in my chest, a tightness in my throat. It was like I wasn't just tired, like something was draining me, pulling the life from me slowly, piece by piece. I forced myself to stand again, this time gripping the trunk of a nearby tree for support. The tree was the same as before, dark, twisted, its bark almost absorbing the light around it. But something was different about it now. The glow was gone, replaced by a sickly, pulsating throb that seemed to echo in the pit of my stomach. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The forest was vast, endless, stretching out in every direction. There was no clear path, no sign of the way I had come. My heart pounded in my chest. The fear, the raw, primal fear, was creeping back into my mind. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But where was here? And how? I began to walk, my steps slow and hesitant. Each footfall was a heavy thud against the earth, and each step seemed to take more effort than the last. The trees around me were unnervingly still. They didn't sway in the wind. They didn't make a sound. I passed the remnants of the disturbed earth, the holes where the shadows had emerged from the ground. The same eerie silence filled the air. No voices. No movement. Just an oppressive, suffocating quiet that pressed in from all sides. And then, I saw it again. A shadow, moving in the corner of my vision, just out of reach. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the trees, standing motionless, as if they too were waiting. Waiting for something to happen. It's not real. It's not real. I told myself, trying to shake off the rising panic. I'm just seeing things. But then I heard it. A soft whisper, like a breath against my ear. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around once more, my eyes wide, searching desperately, but there was nothing there. The whisper came again, this time clearer, more distinct. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was deep, guttural, almost human in its tone. But there was no face to match it, no body. Just the sound, floating on the air, like the forest itself was speaking to me. You're not alone. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that voice. I didn't know how, but I did. It was the same voice I had heard earlier while I was surrounded by the shadows. The one that whispered run. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a promise. You never were. The ground beneath me trembled, just slightly at first, but then more strongly, as though the forest itself was awakening. I looked down, my legs unsteady. The earth was shifting beneath me, the roots of the trees twisting in strange, unnatural patterns. I felt the pull, a force beneath the surface, drawing me in. I staggered backward, my eyes wide with terror. The trees weren't just standing anymore. They were moving. Slowly, imperceptibly, but unmistakably, the branches seemed to reach for me, their gnarled fingers curling in the air, like twisted hands trying to grab hold. The shadows were moving again, creeping along the edges of the trees. No longer were they distant or out of sight. They were closer now, so much closer, and they had shape, form, substance. They were creatures of the forest, born of its dark heart, and they were hungry. I had to move. I had to get away. But my body was betraying me. My legs wouldn't cooperate. The weight in my chest was unbearable, suffocating. I took a step, no, two, and then I stumbled. I fell. The ground swallowed me, as if it was opening up to consume me whole. It's coming for me. The thought was there, clear and loud in my mind. It was coming for me, and I couldn't outrun it. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, the forest would keep pulling me back. I heard the scraping noise again, the sound I had grown so familiar with. It was closer now, louder, as though the forest itself was shifting and sliding, dragging something heavy along the ground. The trees seemed to lean toward me, their branches moving in time with the sound. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, but it was no use. The darkness was closing in, suffocating me. The weight of it pressed against my chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. And then, there was a flash of light. Not the soft, eerie glow of the tree, but a bright, sharp flash that cut through the darkness like a knife. I opened my eyes, blinking against the sudden brightness. I wasn't alone anymore. There was a figure standing in front of me. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a creature of the forest. It was a person, but not like any person I had ever seen. It was wearing my face. I froze, my blood running cold as the figure before me shifted into view. It was me. The same features, same eyes, same hair, same expression of confusion and fear. But there was something off about it. The way it stood, too still, too perfect, like a reflection in a mirror that had taken on its own life. I stepped back, heart pounding, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. How could it be me? Was this some trick of the forest? Some twisted illusion? The figure didn't move, but its eyes, my eyes, seemed to track me, watching every movement, every breath I took. There was no warmth in those eyes. No humanity. Only emptiness. You've seen it, haven't you? The voice was the same as the one I had heard in the forest. It came from the figure's lips, but it wasn't my voice. It was cold, distant, like an echo from deep within the earth. You know what it wants. I shook my head, my throat tight, unable to speak. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen in place. This wasn't possible. None of this was real. It's too late, the figure whispered, its lips curling into a smile that didn't reach its eyes. It already has you. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees shifting, their roots twisting like the fingers of a great beast. The earth itself seemed to groan, the very ground beneath me beginning to pulse with a sickening rhythm. I could feel it now, a presence, not just around me, but within me. It was everywhere. In the air. In my lungs. In my blood. The shadow, it wasn't something outside of me. It was something I had brought with me. Something that had been following me since I first stepped into the forest. I didn't belong here. I looked at the figure again, but it was gone. Vanished, like smoke in the wind. The clearing was empty once more, but the presence remained thick, suffocating, closing in. I turned, desperate to escape, but the forest had already changed. The path I had taken was no longer there. The trees had shifted, the landscape rearranged itself. The forest was alive, shifting, reshaping with every step I took. There was no way out. The whispers started again, soft at first, then louder, overlapping, merging into a cacophony of voices. They all spoke at once, filling my head with words that I couldn't understand, but that carried a weight, an urgency. I clutched my head, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The voices were all around me now, seeping into my thoughts, erasing my own. And then, I saw it. The figure appeared again, but this time it wasn't alone. Shadows emerged from the trees, silent and swift, encircling me. They were the same, dark, formless creatures, but they were closer now, their shapes becoming more distinct. They were no longer just phantoms of the forest, they were real, and they were coming for me. I stumbled backward, my mind in chaos. My breath was shallow, panicked. There was no escape. No hope. I had seen the truth, and it was too late. The ground beneath me gave way, and I tumbled into the earth, falling deeper into the blackness. The trees, the shadows, everything around me seemed to swallow me whole. I couldn't see anything anymore. It was dark, so dark, that even my own thoughts seemed to fade into the void. You are part of it now. The voice was no longer just in my head. It was everywhere. It was in the earth, in the trees, in the very air I breathed. You are the forest. And as I descended into the darkness, the last thing I saw was my reflection, staring back at me, unblinking, unfeeling, absorbed by the blackness. And then, there was nothing. The cry in the backyard. It was late when I first heard it. The sound carried through the still night air, soft at first, like a faint murmur from a distance. A child's cry. I was in bed, lying in the dark, when the noise cut through the silence of the house. It was not an ordinary cry, though. It was different. It sounded as if it were coming from the backyard, just beyond my window. I sat up, heart pounding. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet for it to be a random sound. The houses around me were all empty, mostly second homes with no one occupying them at this hour. Yet there it was again, a soft sob, followed by the sound of a small voice calling out, faint, desperate, and impossible to ignore. I got up, pulled on my slippers, and walked cautiously toward the window. My eyes scanned the backyard. It was barely visible under the dim light of the moon, the backyard completely still, no one in sight. Maybe it's just an animal, I thought, trying to rationalize the noise. Maybe it's a dog or something. But the cries were too human, too unmistakable to be mistaken for an animal's sound. And there was something unsettling about them, as if the air around me had thickened with the weight of their sadness. I shook my head. No. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps some kids playing outside, maybe a prank. I wasn't going to let myself get caught up in superstition. I pulled the curtains back and stepped away from the window. But then, as I turned to walk back to bed, the cry came again. Louder. Clearer. This time, it felt as if it were right there, at the window, just beyond my reach. I froze. I wasn't sure what terrified me more, the fact that the cry was so close, or the fact that I couldn't see who or what was making it. The seconds stretched into minutes, but the silence that followed was suffocating. My thoughts raced. Should I call the police? Go outside? What if someone was in trouble? The rational part of my mind told me it was nothing, just a trick of the night, but the growing unease in my stomach told me otherwise. There was something wrong with this cry, something that felt unnatural, like it didn't belong in the world. I grabbed my phone, dialed the number for the police, but paused before I could press send. What would I even tell them? There's a crying child in my backyard, but I can't see them? My hand trembled. Instead of dialing, I slowly pulled on my jacket and walked toward the back door, heart thudding in my chest. The backyard was dark, the shadows deep and heavy, the only light coming from the distant street lamps. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air brushing against my face. The cry stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. My nerves were on edge. The darkness seemed to press in, but there was no sound, no movement. Nothing. Was I imagining it? Had I just heard things? But then, there it was again. A single, high-pitched wail, coming from the far corner of the yard, near the old wooden shed. My blood ran cold. I was not imagining this. I moved closer, trying to make out any shape in the dark. But all I could see was the faint outline of the shed. The air grew heavier with each step, as though something was pressing down on me. I called out, my voice shaky, "Is someone there?" The silence that followed was suffocating. No reply. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the cry stopped again. I felt a chill spread through me, a deep sense of dread crawling up my spine. The longer I stood there in the cold, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. There was something watching me, something just out of reach, hiding in the darkness. But when I turned to go back inside, I heard it again. Only this time, it wasn't a cry. It was a whisper. "Help me." The voice was soft, pleading, almost as if it were right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty darkness, stretching on forever. The next few days were nothing short of a blur. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or perhaps a trick of the night. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of that voice. The whispers. The cry. I told myself that I'd imagined it, that the mind could play tricks in the quiet of the night. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again. "Help me." The voice lingered, faint but persistent, clawing its way back into my thoughts, refusing to be forgotten. My nights were sleepless. The days were worse. I found myself unable to focus, my thoughts always drifting back to that moment. I couldn't stop myself from staring at the backyard through the window, watching the shadows stretch longer as the sun dipped behind the horizon. It was only when I saw the movement that I knew something was terribly wrong. I had been sitting in my living room, staring out the window, when I saw something shift in the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the branches of the old oak tree. But then I saw it again, a shadow, darting across the yard, too quick, too purposeful to be natural. I stood up, heart hammering in my chest. I knew what I had seen. Something had been there. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the back door, stepping outside. The chill of the evening air bit at my skin, but I barely noticed. My focus was locked on the shadow, now fading into the darkness near the shed. Was it the same shadow from the night I'd heard the cry? I wasn't sure, but I couldn't just stand there. I had to know. The beam from my flashlight sliced through the darkness, but the shed remained empty. No movement. No sound. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt it, an oppressive heaviness in the air, as if the darkness itself were alive, watching, waiting. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest, forcing the air from my lungs. I took a few steps forward, the grass crunching beneath my feet, the light of the flashlight trembling in my hand. There was no wind tonight, no rustling of leaves. The world around me was eerily still, as if it, too, were holding its breath. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The grass had parted, like something was pushing its way through the earth from beneath. I could feel the ground trembling, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to echo through my bones. I stepped back quickly, my heart racing, the light flickering in my hand. The trembling stopped as suddenly as it had started. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it. A child's voice. But not just any voice. The voice was now clear, distinct, and it was coming from beneath me. Help me, please. It wasn't coming from the shed. It wasn't coming from the backyard. It was coming from the very earth itself. I dropped to my knees, my hands trembling as I shone the light onto the patch of grass where I had felt the tremor. The flashlight beam quivered over the ground, and for a moment I thought I saw something darker, something wrong. A figure. A shape, half-formed, as if rising from the earth. But before I could get a better look, the voice cried out again, louder this time, more frantic. The earth beneath me groaned in response, the ground shuddering as if something beneath was trying to break free. I scrambled to my feet, panic flooding my body. I could feel the sweat on my palms, the pulse in my ears. There was something down there, something that was not supposed to be. No, I thought, this isn't real. This isn't happening. But as I turned to run, I heard the voice again, this time louder, angrier. Stay with me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, and saw it. A face. But not just a face. It was a child's face. A pale, hollow face, twisted in pain, its eyes wide with fear and hunger, staring directly at me from the ground. The eyes seemed to shimmer, not with light, but with darkness, absorbing everything in their gaze. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the face vanished, sinking back into the earth, leaving behind only the echo of its cry. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hands. I didn't stop running until I was back inside. The door slammed shut behind me, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it would explode. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, the sound of my own breath the only thing I could hear in the silence that had descended on the house. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating, pressing against me, filling the room with a coldness that I couldn't escape. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. But as I lay there, shaken to my core, I realized something. I wasn't alone anymore. I could still hear the faintest whisper in the back of my mind. Stay with me forever. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that face, the hollow, empty eyes, would appear again. It haunted me, creeping through the edges of my thoughts, reminding me that whatever I had seen in the yard wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. It was here. I stayed in the living room, the faint glow of the TV screen providing a weak shield against the darkness. My heart still raced from the night's events, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me outside. The windows were locked, the door bolted shut, but it didn't feel like enough. How could it? The house was quiet, too quiet, and I found myself listening intently to every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the trees outside. But the silence was deceptive. It wasn't peace. It was something darker, something suffocating. Then came the sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, shifting branches, rustling leaves. But no! It was unmistakable. A child's laughter. I froze. It was soft, playful at first, but the sound seemed to echo through the house. The kind of innocent, carefree laughter a child might make while playing, but there was something off about it. It didn't sound like it came from outside, or even from the house itself. It sounded like it was inside my mind. I stood up quickly, my legs shaky. My heart hammered in my chest. I was still reeling from what I had seen in the yard, but now, this... I couldn't make sense of it. I stepped to the window, cautiously pulling back the curtain. Nothing. The yard was empty, dark, still. The shed sat silent in the distance, just as it had before. There was no movement, no sign of life. But the laughter continued. It echoed again, louder this time, closer, almost as if it were coming from inside the walls. I felt my pulse quicken. I knew that this couldn't be real, that I must be losing my mind. But then, the crying started. The same child's voice from before, clear and sharp through the silence. "Help me, please, help me." I whipped around, but the house was just as I had left it. The living room felt cold, colder than it had before. The walls seemed to close in on me. I didn't know where the voice was coming from. Was it the house? Was it my mind playing tricks? Then, the lights flickered. I jerked back, heart racing in my chest. The laughter had stopped, but the voice didn't. It persisted, louder now, as if the walls themselves were alive. The sound wrapped around me, closing in from all sides. I stumbled toward the door, my mind screaming for me to leave, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as though something was keeping me in place. "Stay with me, stay forever," the voice whispered, the words slow and deliberate, like a chant, like it was pulling at the very core of my being. I took a step back, then another. My body felt numb, my thoughts in a haze. I wasn't sure if I was hearing this or if it was all in my head. But the voice was so clear, so real. "Stay with me." Without thinking, I grabbed my keys, my hands trembling. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place before whatever it was that was haunting me got any closer. But just as I reached the door, the house groaned. It was a deep, guttural sound, as though the foundation itself were shifting, like the earth below was rising up to meet me. I froze in place, my hand on the doorknob. My breath came in shallow gasps. The room felt like it was closing in, suffocating me with its silence and the weight of whatever force was lurking just beneath the surface. The child's voice called again, louder this time, sharper. "Don't leave me. I need you, please, stay." I yanked open the door, my legs shaking beneath me. The night air rushed in, cold and biting, but it didn't help. I could still hear the voice, feel it pressing against my ears. But something else was out there too. I stepped onto the porch and turned to look back at the house. My heart nearly stopped. There, in the yard, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light, was a figure. It was a child. But not a child, not like any child I had ever seen. The figure stood motionless, its face hidden in the shadows, but I could see its pale, outstretched hands reaching toward me, fingers twitching as though it were beckoning me closer. I took a step back, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The voice continued, now more urgent, more desperate. "Come to me, come to me." I tried to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, my feet cemented to the ground. I felt the pull of the figure, the draw of the voice. It was like it had its claws in my soul, and I couldn't escape. The figure stepped forward, just a little, its outline becoming clearer. And then, for the first time, I saw its face. It was a child's face, but hollow, empty, with eyes too wide, too dark, and the same hollow scream that echoed inside me. Before I could even comprehend what was happening, the figure lunged toward me, the world around me swirling into darkness. The last thing I heard was the voice, now a scream. "Stay with me." Then, nothing. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air as though I had been submerged underwater. The sudden silence in the room felt suffocating, and for a moment, I couldn't comprehend where I was. My head spun with confusion, my body still aching from the dream. Was it a dream? The fear, the overwhelming sensation of being pulled into the darkness, still gripped me like a vice. I was on the porch. I looked around, disoriented, but the yard was empty. The figure, the child, had vanished. There was no sign of it, no sign of the scream. But the weight in my chest remained, the unsettling feeling that the nightmare had not ended, that it was still waiting for me, lurking in the shadows. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak, but I couldn't just stand there. I couldn't be still. Something in me screamed to get away from that house, from that place, but my mind was clouded, uncertain, unable to process what had just happened. I looked toward the house. The door was still open, the faint light from inside spilling out onto the porch, offering no comfort. It was as if the house was beckoning me back inside, calling me to finish what I had started. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. Yet, I found myself walking toward it as though an invisible force was pulling me forward. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the very atmosphere was closing in on me. My hands shook as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house had changed. It was the same house, but the air was different, heavier, colder. The walls seemed to close in around me as I moved through the darkened hallway. The familiar creaks of the floorboards beneath my feet were gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. The living room, once a place I had felt safe in, now felt like a tomb. And then, I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, like a breath, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. The voice of a child. "Come play with me. Come stay with me." The words seemed to float in the air around me, curling into my ears, tugging at my mind. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound only grew stronger, clearer, more persistent. "I'm so lonely. Stay with me forever." I turned toward the stairs. The door to the basement was open, the darkness below like an abyss waiting to swallow me whole. The voice was coming from down there. No, it wasn't just a voice, it was something more. It was a pull, a tug, a compulsion to go down into that darkness. I should have run. I should have left, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the stairs, down into the blackened depths below. Each step I took felt like it was dragging me deeper into a nightmare, into the heart of whatever evil had taken root in this house. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The farther I went, the more the darkness pressed in, until I could no longer see my hands in front of my face. "Come to me, you belong here." The voice wrapped around me like a cocoon, its weight almost unbearable. My chest tightened, and the fear was all-consuming. It felt as though the house itself was alive, its walls pulsing with a malevolent energy. I finally reached the bottom of the stairs, and in the blackness, something moved. A figure. I couldn't see it clearly at first, but I could feel its presence. It was there, waiting. The air grew colder, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing, shallow and labored, coming from somewhere nearby. Then, the lights flickered on, revealing the figure. It was a child, but not the child I had seen before. This one was different. It was older, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to stare into my very soul. The child reached out a hand, beckoning me forward, its fingers twisted and broken. The air around it felt unnatural, as though it didn't belong to this world. And then the voice came again, clearer than ever. "Stay with me, forever, you can't leave." I backed away, terror clawing at my insides. This wasn't just a spirit, it wasn't just a voice. It was something far worse, something that had lived here for far too long, feeding off fear and sorrow, feeding off the souls of those who dared enter this house. I turned to run, but the stairs were gone. The floor beneath me crumbled, vanishing into the blackness. I fell forward, my hands flailing for something, anything to grab onto. But there was nothing. The darkness swallowed me whole. The child's voice echoed in my ears as I tumbled deeper, deeper into the void. "You belong to me now, forever." I screamed, but no sound came out. My world was nothing but darkness, and the child's voice, growing louder, closer, until it filled every corner of my mind. And then, there was nothing. Only silence. I woke up in the yard. The air was cold, the night sky clear above me, but the house, my house, was gone. It had vanished, as though it had never been there at all. The yard was empty, silent, just as it had been when I first moved in. I stood up, my body sore, and looked around, confused. Had I been dreaming? Had all of it been a nightmare? But there was no explanation for the terror I had felt, the pull of the darkness, the child's voice. And then I saw it. A small, cracked doll lay in the grass, its glass eyes staring blankly into the sky. It was old, dirty, covered in dust. I reached down to pick it up, my hands trembling. The moment my fingers touched it, the air around me shifted. A cold wind blew through the yard, and in the distance, I could hear it again. The voice. "Come back to me, you belong with me." I dropped the doll, my heart pounding, and ran. But I could still hear it. The voice, always there, always following me. "You will never escape." And I knew then that I never would. It wasn't just the house. It was everything. The land, the air, the very ground beneath my feet seemed to be tangled in some dark, unbreakable web. No matter how far I ran, the voice followed, always just on the edge of my hearing, its whispers wrapping around my mind like a suffocating fog. I kept running, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. But the voice, it wasn't just in the air anymore. It was inside my head. It was part of me now, its tendrils curling around my thoughts, twisting them until all I could hear was its relentless call. "You belong to me. Forever. Come back. You can never leave." I stumbled through the yard, tripping over the uneven ground, my eyes wide with terror. The night felt colder now, the shadows longer, darker. I couldn't escape it. There was no way out. I turned back toward the house, half expecting to see it looming behind me again, its twisted windows staring down like soulless eyes. But there was nothing. The house was gone, disappeared as if it had never existed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me, somewhere just beyond the horizon, somewhere I could never escape. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just voices, but shapes, moving around me in the shadows. Figures, children, dancing in the corners of my vision, their faces twisted with mockery and malice. They were playing, laughing, but their laughter was wrong, echoing with an eerie distortion. I wanted to scream, to make it stop, but no sound came. My mouth was dry, my throat constricted, and the only thing I could do was run. But where? Where could I go that the voice wouldn't follow? I found myself at the edge of a small forest, its trees looming like giants in the dark. There was no path, no trail, just the thick, impenetrable woods stretching out before me. It seemed like the only place left to go. I took a step forward, and then another. My feet moved without my consent, drawn toward the trees, drawn toward the blackness that lay just beyond them. As I entered the forest, the air grew even colder, the trees closer together, their branches thick and gnarled, twisting like twisted hands reaching down to pull me deeper. The darkness here was different, heavier, as though it was alive, watching, waiting. I could feel it again, the pull, the compulsion. It was like a thread wrapping around my soul, drawing me deeper into the woods, deeper into the black heart of whatever this place was. And then I heard it again. The voice. You can't escape. You're mine now. I looked around, panic flooding my veins. The shadows were moving, closing in, and I realized, too late, that the trees themselves were alive, their branches stretching down like monstrous fingers, grasping for me, pulling me closer. I tried to scream, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of the wind, which was now a roar, tearing through the trees. The ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled, falling to my knees as the earth seemed to give way beneath me. And then, the darkness closed in. It was as though the forest swallowed me whole, its branches entangling me, its roots pulling me deeper into the ground. I could feel the earth beneath me, cold and wet, clinging to my skin, pulling me down, down into the very bowels of the earth. I fought against it, but the more I struggled, the tighter the darkness gripped me. The voice, so close now, was in my ears, its words smothering me. You will never leave. You will never escape. You belong here, with us. I could see it now, faces, countless faces, twisted and disfigured, floating in the darkness. Eyes staring out at me from every corner of the night. Children, their faces pale and empty, their mouths open in silent screams. I was surrounded. The trees, the shadows, the faces, all closing in, tightening around me like a cage. Forever. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a small room. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. It was as though I had been here for ages, though I couldn't remember how I had arrived. I stood up, my body weak and disoriented. My hands trembled as I reached for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, and I stepped out into the hallway. It was familiar, too familiar. The same crooked walls, the same dusty floorboards. The same house. But the house wasn't real. It couldn't be. I heard the whispers again, faint at first, but growing louder. The voice, relentless, cold, and suffocating, calling me back. You're still mine. You can't escape. Forever. I turned and ran, but this time I didn't look back. This time I wouldn't let it win. And yet, deep down, I knew there was no escaping it. The house, the voice, it was all a part of me now. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I fought, it would never stop. I would never stop. Because I was already lost. The Island of the Lonely. The fog hung low over the island like a suffocating blanket. I could barely make out the outlines of the houses scattered across the shore, their windows dark and lifeless. The island was supposed to be a safe haven, a temporary refuge from the chaos of the mainland after the storms had ravaged everything in their path. But there was something wrong. Something unsettling about the stillness that had descended upon this place. I had arrived a few days ago with a group of survivors, people who had nowhere else to go. We had heard rumors of this island, isolated, untouched by the worst of the storms, offering shelter and supplies. But when we set foot on its shores, we were greeted with eerie silence. No voices, no movement. Just the endless stretch of empty houses and the thick fog that seemed to choke the life out of everything. At first, we thought it was just the aftermath of the disaster. People had fled the mainland, looking for a place to escape, and the island was supposed to be a temporary refuge. But that first night, when the fog rolled in, things started to feel off. I was staying in one of the small cottages, a modest place that seemed to have been abandoned for years. The furniture was covered in dust, the windows cracked, and the air smelled of old wood and mildew. But it was shelter. It was safe, at least, that's what we thought. I had trouble sleeping the first night. The quiet was oppressive, unnatural. The only sound was the occasional creak of the house settling, but that was enough to send shivers down my spine. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps outside, the faint echo of someone moving around in the fog. But when I checked, there was nothing. The next morning, the island was still eerily quiet. The others were the same, uneasy, looking around, wondering if they were just imagining things. But there was no denying it. Something was wrong. By the third day, people started to disappear. It started with Mark, a young man who had been helping me gather supplies. He was last seen near the southern shore, walking along the waterline when he suddenly vanished into the fog. We searched for hours, calling his name, but there was no sign of him, no trace, no footprints in the sand, nothing. At first, we thought he had wandered off, maybe gone for help. But when the next person, Lisa, disappeared the same way, we began to worry. Lisa had been sitting on the porch, reading a book, when she stood up and walked toward the forest line. We thought she was just going for a walk, but she never returned. And this time, there was no sign of her either. Panic began to set in. Some of us wanted to leave, to swim back to the mainland, but the fog was so thick, the water so treacherous, we had no way of knowing if we'd ever make it. We were trapped. Stranded on this island, surrounded by an oppressive silence that grew heavier with each passing day. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the others had gotten lost in the fog. Maybe they had found shelter elsewhere. But deep down, I knew the truth. The island was not what it seemed. There was something here, something pulling the others away. Something that wanted us to stay. That night, I stayed awake, watching the fog roll in. I had barricaded myself in my room, locking the windows, pushing furniture against the door. But it didn't help. The noises started again, soft whispers, like the wind carrying voices from far off, but they were close, too close. I stood at the window, heart racing, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling in the yard, curling around the house like fingers, reaching for me. Then I saw it. A figure, pale and ghostly, moving through the fog. At first, I thought it was one of the others, but the figure was wrong. It moved unnaturally, jerking and twitching as it walked. It was too tall, too thin, and its face was obscured by the fog, but I could feel its eyes on me. The whispers grew louder. Come to us. I stepped back from the window, panic flooding my body. I had to get out, had to leave before whatever it was found me. I grabbed my things, just enough to survive, and made my way to the front door. The house was silent again, but I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. The figure in the fog was still there, its presence like a dark cloud on the horizon. I had to move fast. I knew that if I stayed here, I would be next. As I stepped outside, I felt the cold air hit me, and the fog seemed to swallow me whole. I could barely see the path ahead, but I knew I had to keep going. Every step I took, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. You belong here. Forever. I tried to run, but the fog seemed to slow me down, wrapping around my legs, pulling me back. The more I struggled, the more the whispers grew, until they filled my mind completely, drowning out everything else. Forever. Forever. I couldn't escape it. The island had claimed me. And just like the others, I would disappear into the fog, lost to time, a part of the island's twisted, endless cycle. Forever. The fog thickened, becoming an impenetrable wall around me. Each breath I took felt heavier, suffocating, as though the very air was trying to crush me. I stumbled through the darkness, my hands reaching out, grasping for something, anything that could pull me back to safety. But there was nothing. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, to change, as if the island itself was alive, moving, shifting to keep me trapped. I could hear it now, the soft, mournful cries of the missing. The sound of voices, children's voices, floating on the breeze. Their cries were not distant, but close, too close. I froze, fear clutching at my chest. The voices were coming from all directions, overlapping, merging into a chorus of sadness and desperation. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. The island was not just empty. It was haunted. The souls of those who had vanished, Mark, Lisa, the others, were still here, trapped in the fog, unable to leave. They were calling to me, pulling me deeper into their world, into the darkness that claimed them. Come to us. I turned quickly, but there was no one. No figure in the fog. Yet the feeling of being watched, being followed, never left. I felt it growing stronger, pressing against me like an invisible hand, urging me to turn back, to give in, to join them. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I forced myself to keep moving, each step a bow. The fog seemed to be thinning slightly, a break in the dense mist. Just ahead, I could see a flicker of light, faint and distant, like the glow of a lantern. A part of me wanted to believe it was another person, someone who had found their way, someone who could help me. But deep down, I knew better. The light was false. A lure. I tried to push the thought away, but it gnawed at me, growing louder, more insistent. I reached the light and found a small, crumbling shack at the edge of the forest. Its door hung ajar, and the faint glow I had seen was coming from within. I stepped cautiously inside, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was small, barely more than a shelter, but the air was thick with the same heavy silence that had haunted me since my arrival. I could see nothing at first, only darkness, until I noticed something strange, something in the corner. A figure sat on the floor, facing the wall. Its head was bowed, and it made no move to acknowledge my presence. For a long moment, I simply stared, unsure of what to do. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it turned toward me. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, empty and hollow, as if they had seen too much, experienced too much. The figure's face was gaunt, skeletal, with patches of skin hanging loosely from its bones. But the most terrifying thing was its smile. A wide, empty grin stretched across its face, as if it were waiting for something it had wanted for a long time. "Join us," it whispered, its voice like the wind, dry and cracked. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the stillness of the room. The figure stood up, its movements slow, deliberate, like a puppet being controlled by some unseen force. Its limbs creaked and groaned, but it moved toward me with terrifying purpose. I backed away, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. I was trapped, the air thick and heavy, the figure advancing toward me, its eyes never leaving mine. Forever. The fog outside pressed against the walls, creeping in through the cracks, suffocating the room, suffocating me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I knew I couldn't escape. The island had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others. There was no leaving. The figure reached out, its cold, skeletal hand brushing my cheek. The touch was like ice, sending a jolt of fear through my body. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in its gaze. Forever. I could feel my body growing weaker, my limbs heavy as if the very essence of the island was draining the life out of me. The light in the shack flickered, dimming until all that was left was the oppressive darkness. And then, just as the figure's hand closed around my throat, a voice broke through the silence. It wasn't the figure's voice. It wasn't the whispers of the lost souls. It was something else. A soft, distant voice, familiar, comforting. It was Mark's voice. "It's not real. It's not real." But it was too late. The darkness consumed me, and the island claimed another soul. Forever. The darkness was overwhelming, an all-consuming void that swallowed every thought, every sensation. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. There was only the suffocating presence of the island around me. I thought I had lost consciousness, thought that I had slipped into some kind of endless nightmare, but then came a sound, a familiar sound. The faintest whisper of a voice, calling my name. Alex. The voice was soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, then clearer, louder, more insistent. I felt my heart skip a beat. My eyes fluttered open, but the darkness remained thick and impenetrable. Yet I could feel the presence of someone, or something, there, standing just beyond the edge of my vision. "Alex, help us." The voice wasn't Mark's. It was softer, younger. "Lisa." I knew it instantly. Her voice, distant and desperate, echoed in my mind, pulling me toward it. I reached out instinctively, hoping to find something, anything that would guide me, lead me out of this suffocating blackness. But the world around me remained still. Silent. Void. Then came another sound. A faint scraping noise, like nails on wood. I turned toward it, my body trembling with fear, but all I saw was darkness. The scraping continued, growing louder, closer. A shift in the air. Suddenly, a flicker of light pierced through the dark. It wasn't the comforting glow of a lantern or a fire, but a flicker that felt wrong, unnatural. I squinted, trying to focus. As my eyes adjusted, I saw shapes moving in the dim light, figures. They were moving in a slow, deliberate fashion, swaying from side to side, their forms shifting and blending with the shadows around them. They were everywhere now, surrounding me. "Help us." The voice was louder now, closer. "Lisa." But something was different. Her voice, once filled with hope, now seemed hollow, tainted by something darker, something I couldn't comprehend. I wanted to move, wanted to escape, but I was paralyzed, my body frozen in place. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the figures were no longer just shadows. They were real. Real, but wrong. Deformed. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, empty and endless. One of them stepped closer to me. It was Mark, or rather, what was left of him. His face was twisted in agony, skin stretched taut over bone, his eyes hollow and dark. His lips moved, but the words that came out were not his own. "Join us, Alex. Forever." I tried to scream, but my voice was lost, swallowed by the void. I could feel them closing in, each figure coming closer, their hands outstretched toward me. The cold of their touch was like ice, chilling me to the core. But it wasn't just physical cold, it was as if they were draining the warmth from my very soul, pulling me into their darkness. "Don't fight it." The voices surrounded me, overlapping, twisting, becoming one. I felt my mind unraveling, my sense of self slipping away. The island had taken them, and now it was trying to take me. I could feel my body weakening, my limbs becoming heavy, like I was sinking into the ground, into the very island itself. The darkness pressed in on all sides, suffocating me, consuming me. And then, just as I thought I could hold on no longer, something broke through the fog. A crack. A sliver of light. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I fought against the pull of the figures, my body trembling with the effort, and took a step toward the light. "Alex." The voices were fading now, distant, almost desperate. I reached out, my hand trembling, desperate to find the source of the light. The cold hands of the figures reached for me, but I pushed them away, fighting with everything I had left. The light grew brighter, more intense, until it engulfed me completely. And then, there was nothing. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for air. My chest heaved, and my body was drenched in cold sweat. I looked around, empty. The shack, the fog, the island, gone. I was lying in the dirt, outside the remains of the old house I had wandered into earlier. The sun was setting in the distance, casting an eerie orange glow over the land. My heart still raced, my body shaking uncontrollably. The fog was gone, but the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my vision, never left. I stumbled to my feet, my head spinning. My mind was a mess of confusion, but there was one thing I was sure of now: the island hadn't let go of me. It was still out there, somewhere, waiting. As I made my way back toward the shore, I saw something in the sand, footprints. But not just footprints. They were fresh, leading toward the water. The island had claimed me once. I didn't know how long I would be free this time, but I would never escape the island. Never. Not truly. I followed the footprints, my legs moving almost of their own accord, the ground beneath my feet soft and unsteady. The air felt heavy, as though the entire island was holding its breath, waiting. The sun, once warm, now cast an unsettling, orange hue over the horizon. The sky seemed to bleed into the sea, the line between the two growing hazy and indistinct. I tried to shake off the unease crawling up my spine, but it clung to me like the thick fog that had swallowed us earlier. The footprints, clear and defined, led me to the water's edge, where the waves lapped gently against the shore, as if the island itself were breathing. But when I reached the shoreline, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the sand, something had been etched into the earth. Not just footprints, These were symbols, twisted and grotesque, carved deep into the sand, their shapes disturbing in their complexity. The same symbols I had seen in the abandoned house. The same markings that had made my skin crawl and my mind race with dread. I crouched down, my fingers trembling as they brushed the surface of the symbols. The sand was strangely cold, like it had been touched by something unnatural, something that didn't belong. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but then I heard it, faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. Alex. The voice, distorted and twisted, reached me once more. It was Lisa. Or at least, it sounded like her. The voice echoed through the air, the words distant but unmistakable. The wind picked up, carrying the voice closer, until it seemed to be all around me. Alex, help us. We never left. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, my senses on high alert. The water, the sand, the sky, they all felt wrong, like they were no longer part of the world I knew. A heavy silence followed the whisper, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining things. But then, something moved. A shape, out of the corner of my eye, shifting in the shadows. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. There, just beyond the water's edge, a figure stood. It was blurry at first, indistinct, like a shadow caught between the world of the living and the dead. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it clearly. It was Mark. Or something that had once been Mark. His face was a pale, hollow mask, his eyes black pits of nothingness. His clothes hung from him in tatters, the fabric torn and shredded as if he'd been dragged across the ground. His mouth moved, but no words came out, only a guttural sound, like the low rumble of something terrible, something ancient. He was moving toward me, dragging his feet through the sand, his gaze locked on mine with a chilling intensity. Alex. He whispered again, his voice distant and disjointed. I felt my knees tremble, the ground beneath me beginning to feel unstable, as though the island itself was shifting. The figures, the voices, they were all around me now, no longer distant echoes, but tangible, present. I could feel their eyes on me, their cold, empty gazes, their hands reaching for me through the shadows. I took a step back, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. The air seemed thicker, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on me, suffocating me. My heart hammered in my chest as I looked toward the horizon, toward the ocean. The water, calm moments before, was now rippling violently, as though something beneath the surface was stirring. Help us, Alex. The voices were coming faster now, overlapping, growing louder. They surrounded me, pressing in from all sides, drowning out everything else. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape. And then, from the depths of the water, something rose. It was a figure, tall and monstrous, its form indistinct but menacing. Its presence was overwhelming, a force of pure darkness that seemed to bend the world around it. I tried to run, tried to move, but my body was frozen, locked in place by the weight of the island's grip. The figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. And as it loomed over me, I knew this was it. The island had claimed me. It had claimed us all. With one final, earth-shattering scream, I was pulled under, swallowed by the dark waters, the voices of the lost calling my name as the island closed in around me. And in the suffocating depths, I knew there would be no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. The darkness of the ocean swallowed everything. My lungs burned as I struggled for air, but it was futile. The water was thick with the weight of it all, memories, voices, lost souls. I could hear them now, so clear, so close. The same whispers that had chased me across the island, the same chilling sounds that had once seemed so distant. They were here now, right next to me. Alex. The voice was unmistakable. It was Lisa, or the shadow of her. Her words, soft but piercing, wrapped around me like a noose. Alex, you can't escape. I gasped, my body convulsing as I was pulled deeper, the pressure of the water growing unbearable. The shadows seemed to stretch around me, their dark forms twisting and curling like serpents. I reached out, trying to grab hold of something, anything, but there was nothing. The water had become my prison. In the distance, I could see shapes, faint but growing clearer. Figures. People. They were standing just beyond the reach of my desperate grasp, their faces twisted with fear and anguish, their bodies motionless, trapped in the same abyss. We're all here, Alex, Lisa's voice echoed again, but this time it was no longer just a whisper. It was a scream that rattled the very core of my being. We never left. You never left. I turned my head wildly, my heart racing, my mind spiraling. What was happening? What was this place? The water felt colder, the air thinner, and the weight of it all pressed against me, suffocating me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The figures in the distance began to move, slowly at first, their shapes shifting in unnatural ways. They were walking toward me, or was I being dragged toward them? The confusion twisted my thoughts, and the fear grew, a gnawing, relentless force that consumed every part of me. Come closer, Alex. Come home. I felt the pull. It was undeniable, stronger than any will to fight. The figures were right in front of me now, their eyes empty, hollow, void of life. Their hands reached out, touching me, but it wasn't skin, it wasn't flesh. It was something else, something colder, darker, like the water itself. I tried to pull away, tried to resist, but the pressure was too much. The figures surrounded me, their hands holding me fast, their voices now a cacophony of desperate cries and twisted laughter. My head spun, my body went limp in their grasp. I was no longer fighting. I was no longer aware of my own movements. I was simply drifting in a place between life and death, a place where the island's grip was unbreakable. I closed my eyes, and for a moment everything was still. But the stillness was deceptive. There was something else now. A presence. Something older, more ancient than the island itself. It was rising, something vast and unknowable, from the depths of the water. Its form, if it had one, was nothing I could comprehend. It was beyond thought, beyond reason. The figures began to chant, their voices merging into a single, horrific sound, a sound that resonated deep within me, deep within my very soul. You belong to the island now. The last thing I felt was the weight of the water pushing down on me, the finality of it. The darkness closed in completely, and I was consumed by the island. I had never truly left, and now I never would. The voices, the figures, the island itself, all of it had claimed me. And as I sank into the blackness, I understood. There was no escaping. Not from the island. Not from the truth. We were all prisoners here, forever bound to the place of endless isolation. Forever alone. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.